You've heard this story before. A boy, a giant, a single stone. But here's what nobody told you. Goliath wasn't just big. He was a professional killing machine, trained from birth, undefeated, the most feared warrior in the ancient Near East. And David? He wasn't a warrior. He was a shepherd, a boy who smelled like sheep, the youngest son, the one his own family didn't think was worth summoning when the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel. So how did he win? And what does this 3,000-year-old story actually mean? The answer will change how you see this story forever. Welcome to the Hebrew Stories. This is the place where we take the ancient world of the Hebrew Bible and make it real. Not myths, not Sunday school summaries, not fairy tales. Real history, real people, real archaeology, and real lessons that have survived 3,000 years for a reason. Today we're going back to around 1025 BC, to a narrow valley in the hills of ancient Judah, a valley called the Valley of Elah. Two armies are camped on opposite hillsides, staring at each other across the valley floor below. The tension has been building for weeks, and then one man steps forward from the Philistine side. He walks alone into the open ground between the two armies. His name is Goliath. And what happens next would be told and retold for the next 3,000 years. To understand this story, you need to understand the world it happened in. Israel in 1025 BC was a fragile, newly formed kingdom. Their first king, Saul, had only recently united the 12 tribes. Before that, Israel had been a loose collection of tribes with no central government, no standing army, no unified identity. They were figuring out what it meant to be a nation. And right on their doorstep was one of the most formidable military powers in the ancient world, the Philistines. The Philistines were not native to Canaan. Archaeological evidence suggests they came from the Aegean, possibly from the Greek coast or the islands of the eastern Mediterranean. They arrived in waves during the 12th century BC and settled along the coastal lowlands of what is now southern Israel. They built 5 great cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. And they brought something the Israelites desperately lacked: iron. Iron swords, iron spear tips, iron discipline, a professional military tradition. While Israel was still learning to function as a kingdom, the Philistines had been fighting organized wars for generations. Their champion, their greatest warrior, came from the city of Gath. And here is something remarkable. In 2005, archaeologists excavating at Tel es-Safi in modern Israel, the site of ancient Gath, uncovered a pottery shard dating back nearly 3,000 years. Inscribed on it were 2 names phonetically similar to the name Goliath. Not proof of the man himself, but proof that names like Goliath existed in Gath at exactly the time the Bible describes. This wasn't legend. This was a real place, a real culture, a real conflict. The Hebrew Bible describes Goliath in extraordinary detail, and the details matter. His height. The traditional Hebrew text, called the Masoretic text, gives his height as 6 cubits and a span. Using ancient measurements, that works out to roughly 9 feet 9 inches, nearly 3 meters tall. Extraordinary. Almost unbelievable. But here is where it gets interesting. The oldest surviving manuscripts of this story tell a different number. The Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient Hebrew manuscripts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in 1947, some dating back over 2,000 years, give Goliath's height as 4 cubits and a span. That's closer to 6 feet 9 inches. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls. 6 feet 9 inches. Still enormous by ancient standards. The average Israelite man stood around 5 feet 4 inches tall. Goliath would have towered over every man on that battlefield. But perhaps more importantly, he would have been a plausible human being, not a fairy tale monster, a real warrior of extraordinary size, and his equipment confirmed his status. A bronze helmet, a coat of mail. The Bible says it weighed 5,000 shekels. That's approximately 57 kilograms, nearly 60 kilograms of armor on his body. Compare that to a medieval knight's full plate armor, which weighed around 36 kilograms. Goliath carried nearly double that. Bronze greaves protecting his legs, a bronze javelin strapped across his back, a massive spear with an iron tip weighing 600 shekels, and walking ahead of him, a dedicated shield bearer. He was not just a big man, he was a military system, a weapon of psychological warfare as much as physical combat. For 40 days he had been walking out between the two armies, twice a day, morning and evening, delivering the same challenge. Choose a man from your side, send him to fight me. If he wins, we become your servants. If I win, you become ours. 40 days. Not a single Israelite moved, not even Saul, the tallest man in all of Israel. David was the youngest of 8 sons born to Jesse of Bethlehem. He was a shepherd. While his older brothers went to war, David stayed behind to tend the family's flock. He knew the wilderness. He knew the hills. He knew how to protect his animals from the predators that came in the night. One day his father Jesse gave him a task. Take this bread to your brothers. Take these 10 loaves of grain. Take these 10 cuts of cheese for their commanders. Go and see how they're doing. So David set out for the valley of Elah. He arrived at the camp, left his supplies with the baggage keeper, and went to find his brothers at the battle line. He was still greeting them when the noise began. Goliath stepping forward. The same challenge, the same thundering voice rolling across the valley. And something happened inside David that hadn't happened in 40 days of watching this. He got angry. He started asking questions. Who is this Philistine? Why is no one answering him? What will be done for the man who kills him? His oldest brother Eliab heard him and turned on him with contempt. Why are you here? Who's watching those few sheep back home? I know you. You came here just to watch the fighting. But David wouldn't be silenced. Word reached King Saul. There's a boy who wants to fight. Saul summoned David and looked at him. What he saw must have been discouraging. You can't fight this Philistine. You're just a boy. He's been a warrior his entire life. David's response was not arrogance. It was evidence. He said, Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it. I grabbed it by the fur. I struck it down and killed it. When a bear came, same thing. This Philistine will be the same, because he has defied the armies of the living God. Saul looked at this boy, and he made a decision. Go, and may the Lord be with you. He offered David his own armor, his bronze helmet, his coat of mail. David put them on, tried to walk, and stopped. I cannot walk in these. I'm not used to them. He took them off. He went to a nearby stream, and he selected 5 smooth stones, placed them in his shepherd's bag. 5 stones. Why 5? The Hebrew Bible later mentions that Goliath had brothers. Some scholars believe David came prepared. If Goliath had allies who rushed to the fight, David would be ready. He took his sling in his hand and walked down into the valley. Goliath saw him coming, and he felt something he probably hadn't felt in a long time. Insulted. He looked at this boy, ruddy-cheeked, carrying a shepherd's staff, and he was offended. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? He cursed David by his gods. Come here, and I'll feed your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David didn't flinch. He shouted back across the open ground. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. Then he reached into his bag. He ran toward Goliath. He placed a stone in his sling. He released it. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant pitched forward, face down on the ground. David ran to him, stood over him, took Goliath's own sword, the sword the giant had carried into battle, and finished the fight. The Philistine army had been watching from their hillside. When they saw their champion was dead, they didn't think about the deal they had made. They ran. The Israelites poured down from their hill in pursuit, and a boy from Bethlehem changed the course of history. Here is what almost everyone misses about this story. We focus on the miracle, the one stone, the giant falling. But there's a military reality here that is hiding in plain sight. Goliath was a close combat specialist. Look at his weapons: a javelin for throwing, a spear for thrusting, a sword for close fighting, 60 kilograms of armor that would crush a smaller man in a wrestling match. He was designed to fight at close range. But David never closed the distance. A trained slinger in the ancient world was not a child playing games. Military slingers were among the most effective ranged weapons of the ancient Near East. They could deliver a projectile with enormous force. Some estimates suggest equivalent to a modern handgun, and they could do it from over 100 meters away. David had been practicing with that sling for years, every day in the fields, every time a predator threatened his flock. He wasn't improvising. He was doing exactly what he had trained to do. He chose a battlefield that neutralized Goliath's advantages entirely. He rejected Saul's armor because he understood something critical. You do not fight with equipment you haven't trained with. Saul's armor would have slowed him down, reduced his range, turned his greatest advantage, speed and accuracy, into a liability. David won because he was honest about who he was. But there's something even deeper happening in this text. The Hebrew Bible places this story at a specific moment in Israel's history for a reason. Saul was Israel's first king, chosen by God, tall, strong, impressive, the obvious leader. The man everyone pointed to and said, "There is our king." But when Goliath stepped into the valley, Saul did nothing. For 40 days he stood on his hill and watched. The Hebrew Bible is making a point here that goes beyond one battle. It's asking a question about what leadership actually means. Is a leader someone who looks impressive, or someone who acts when everyone else is frozen? Saul had every advantage: height, armor, military experience, kingly authority. David had none of those things. He had a sling, 5 stones, and a clarity of purpose that cut through the fear like a blade. The ancient Jewish tradition has a teaching that applies here. The Talmud says, "The difference between a hero and a coward is not what they feel. It is what they do with what they feel." Goliath was terrifying. David almost certainly felt the fear. But David also felt something else, a certainty, a sense that the situation was not what everyone around him believed it to be. Everyone else saw a giant who couldn't be beaten. David saw a man who had been defying God for 40 days, and those are two completely different problems. 3,000 years have passed since a boy walked into a valley with 5 stones and changed everything. And we still tell this story. Not because it's a nice fairy tale, not because it has a happy ending, but because every single generation recognizes something in it. The overwhelming obstacle. The moment when everyone else has decided it cannot be done. The question: is there anyone willing to step forward? The name Goliath has entered every language on earth as a symbol. The insurmountable opponent, the giant in your path. And the name David has entered every language as the answer. Not the strongest, not the most qualified, not the most obvious choice. The one who showed up anyway. The Hebrew Bible doesn't promise that the stone always lands. It doesn't promise that the Philistines always run. Life is more complicated than that. But it preserves this story, carefully, precisely, with details about armor weights and stone types and the exact words shouted across a valley, because something in it is true about the human condition. The size of your obstacle is not the measure of what's possible. The measure of what's possible is what you're willing to become. David didn't walk into that valley as a warrior. He walked in as a shepherd. He walked out as the future king of Israel. That's the real story of David and Goliath, and it's only the beginning. Thank you for watching the Hebrew Stories. If this video added something to your day, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Next time, we go deeper into the story of King David, into the palace, into the complexity, into the man behind the legend. And I promise you, it is far more extraordinary than you think. See you then.